In this lesson, we're going to learn how to adjust some very, very important ray tracing features whenever it comes time to render things like reflective or refractive materials. Right, so we're going to work with a couple of different scene files in this particular lesson. So the first one I'm going to start with is lesson 8_reflection. So what I have set up in this scene is just a simple sphere, and surrounding this sphere we have basically a wall of mirrors, or a tube of mirrors. So what we should be able to start seeing in these mirrors are reflections, and within these mirrors we should start to see the reflections of the reflections and sort of start to get kind of a hall of mirrors type of effect. So let's come back and start to undo those. So I'll just press Shift Z. Now let's render this out by just pressing Shift Q. And once the render is complete, we can actually start to see some reflections of the sphere. So if you're using Mental Ray for rendering, we should see this little control panel down at the bottom, and within this area we can start to adjust things like the maximum reflections and the maximum refractions. Okay, so let's start by taking the maximum reflections, which is what we're currently dealing with, our reflective properties, and let's just see what happens if we bring this all the way down to 0. And let's render this and just see what we get. And you can see we're basically just left with a black surface because there are no reflections whatsoever being calculated here. So now let's come in and give this one reflection bounce to calculate. Right? And now we can start to see a little bit more clearly exactly what's happening. So what this is doing is basically telling Mental Ray to calculate the result after one reflection bounce. So we can see the reflection in this first mirror of this little orange sphere, but back behind here we can't actually see the reflection that we should be getting from the mirrors that are on this back side. Right? If we want to actually begin seeing those, we have to introduce more reflection bounce calculations. So if I increase this to 2 and re-render, now we can start to see another layer or another level of reflection within this mirror. Now let's say we wanted to now increase this to a really, really high value. So we want to now start to see a lot of these different spheres in here. So let's say we bring this maximum reflections up to something like 30. Right, so now we should see a whole lot of different spheres, but what we'll probably notice is that that's not actually the case. You can see that while we really don't have this black result within the mirrors anymore, we definitely don't have anywhere near the 30 spheres that we would expect to see. So what we have to do is actually go into the render setup and begin accessing some parameters that we don't have access to within this little menu. So let's go back to the render setup, and if we take a look inside the renderer tab and begin scrolling down, we have the reflections and refractions. Again, this is found within the Mental Ray renderer. If using Scanline, this may be located in a slightly different area. You can see that we do have our maximum reflections set to 30. However, there's a parameter just above this called max trace depth. Now this is sort of a global override. So regardless of what we have set here, because of this global override, we're still only limited to calculating 6 of these ray bounces, or these ray interactions. So what this is saying is that even though we have 30 reflections and 6 refractions, it's only going to calculate a total of 6 passes between the two, or a total of 6 interactions. So if we had a scene that required, let's say, a very high number of reflections and still needs a high number of refractions, let's say we had a lot of glass in our scene, what we would want to make sure of is that this number up here is the sum of these two numbers down here. So let's say we increase the max trace depth to 36, so that way we get all 30 ray reflections and all 6 refractions. Now let's come in and re-render. You'll notice that we still don't have anywhere near the number of spheres that we would expect to see. So this is where this can start to become a little bit more scene dependent. So if you have the appropriate number of reflections set here, and we are certain that we have the highest number or a high enough number of the maximum trace depth, at that point, now we have to start exploring some of the materials, because some of these different materials actually have a number of overrides that will limit the amount of ray interactions that happen on that material. So in my case, because it's the mirror that is actually not working properly, that should be the first place that we look, is on this actual mirror material. Right, so I'm going to go in and open up the material editor. Just press M on my keyboard. And if we scroll all the way down to the bottom and take a look at the scene materials, we have the mirror material, which in my case I'm using a mental ray architectural and design material for this. If we double click to open this up in the parameter editor and begin scrolling down, in this particular material, we have to take a look inside the advanced rendering options. And if you take a look inside reflections, you'll notice that right now this has a maximum trace depth of only 4 reflection interactions. Now, again, depending on what material you're using, this may be located in a completely different area. But let's make sure that we take this and increase this to the appropriate value. And now let's try to re-render again. Again, I'll just press Shift-Q on my keyboard. And now we have something that is more like what we would expect to see. So again, just keep in mind that depending on your particular scene and your particular situation, you may have to increase these values pretty high, and you may actually have to set these values in several different areas. And then also just keep in mind that as we start to increase this number, we will actually start to slow down our renders quite a bit because we are giving Mental Ray quite a bit of additional information to have to calculate now. So we've seen how this works on reflections. Let's take a look at how this is going to work on refractions. All right, so this scene is going to be called lesson 08_refractions. Now let's come in and just take a look at what we have. Again, pressing Shift-Q on my keyboard. All right, now in this scene, I've intentionally set the refraction interactions down pretty low so we can actually see what is happening. So we can start to see some very basic refractions happening in this area. And if we were to come in and just use my middle mouse wheel to scroll in on this area, you can see this particular orange piece of glass. You can see we do see some good refractions right in this area, but wherever we see the transparency through this clear piece of glass, you notice the refractions look very, very different. Right? These are the sorts of rendering errors that we can start to get whenever working with a lot of refractive surfaces, lots of different glass materials and things like that. So what we have to be aware of whenever working with these types of materials is the actual surface that we're working with. So I'm going to press Alt-W on my keyboard to go back to a 4-panel view. And I'll select something like this left. And again, Alt-W. Now, what we have to take a look at, or what we have to be aware of, is that whenever dealing with a lot of refractive surfaces, a lot of times we're going to build these using some kind of a double-sided surface. So in this case, you can see that we have the outer part of the glass that comes out and around, and then it actually comes all the way back in and back down. So there's actually 2 different sides to the glass. Now, each of these sides counts as one interaction. So for the refraction rays, this first surface counts as 1 interaction. The second one counts as 2. So if we want these refraction rays just to be able to make it through the glass, we have to make sure that there are at least 4 ray interactions. So 1, 2, and then as it passes out the other side, 3 and 4. All right, so again, let's go back. I'll open up my render setup. Take a look inside the renderer tab, scroll down, and make sure that we do have the appropriate number of refractions. So let's set this up to something like 8 refraction interactions. So that way, 1, 2 interactions to get through this first side, 3, 4 to get through this back side, and then we also have to consider this glass back behind. So we're going to need another 2 and 4 interactions to get this ray all the way through both of these surfaces at this area, at the point where they both overlap. So again, let's go back to the rendered frame window. You can see we have now a higher number of refractions. Let's render this out. Right, you can see that this looks a little bit better as far as now being able to see some nice refractions that are happening on the back side of this material. But we still have a similar situation where if we were to come in and just use our middle mouse wheel to scroll in on this area, you can see we still are not able to see the refractions through this area. So that means that despite the settings in the maximum number of refractions, we still don't have enough to be able to reach through this area where these 2 surfaces actually overlap. We can actually see the transparency, so we can see this little checkerboard pattern back behind this orange glass, but you can see that the refractions are not visible in this area, as we should be able to see something similar to this in this area. So what this means is there's a pretty good likelihood that there's something in this material itself that we need to set. Because if we, again, take a look inside the render setup, we know for sure that we have a high enough number of refractions that should be able to reach through that. We definitely have a high enough trace depth to allow for all of these interactions to take place. So that pretty much, as a just a process of elimination, just leaves the materials. So let's come back, and let me just actually undo this camera movement so we can maybe try to get this camera back to where it was. There we are. Now I'm going to press the M key on my keyboard so I can open up the slate material editor. And I do have a couple of different materials, this material number 51 and number 52. These are the two glass materials. So if we click and drag this out into our viewing area, just double click on either one of these. And again, because I am using the architectural and design material, if we take a look inside the advanced rendering rollout, scroll down, again we can see that we have, similar to what we had in the reflections a little bit ago, we have the same kind of limitation for the refractions. So we want to make sure that we set that up to an appropriate value. So 8 refraction interactions here. Let's make sure we do this on the orange material as well. Total of 8 interactions. Let's go in and check on this rendered frame window. Take this and we'll clone this so we can actually have something to compare this against. Now let's come in and re-render this and see if we're on the right track. All right, excellent. And now you can see that we're getting something that is much, much closer to what we should be getting. So now you can start to see some much, much better interactions within these different materials. So if we're to do just a quick little side-by-side comparison, you can definitely see, whereas before we were having a lot of these rendering errors, now those have been fixed by just simply adjusting and just kind of massaging some of these settings with the reflection and refraction ray interactions. All right, but the main thing that you want to be aware of is that using these settings and starting to increase these settings will definitely increase the amount of time required for this render to take place. So really take a look at your scene, analyze it, make sure that you are only using the maximum number of interactions that you really need. So take a look at how many surfaces these rays need to be able to pass through, and in order to keep your render times moving as quickly as possible, just use the bare minimum settings. Right, so that's a look at some of these really, really important ray trace settings that we need to be aware of whenever working with any kind of reflective or refractive materials.